Hi. So I seem to be the token academic on this panel. So I will speak to you in my academic role. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, as a social scientist, we might think about this general crisis of democracy that this conference is all about, and in particular about the rise of populist parties, which will continue some of the conversation from the previous panel. So what we've gotten a lot, I think, so far, both in the previous panel and at different points over the course of today and yesterday, is a lot of discussion of some of the grievances that have fed both the rise of populist parties, dissatisfaction with democracy, yada, yada, yada. And that is clearly a significant part of what's going on, right? And these grievances tend to fall into two major categories, right? Which I'm sure everybody here both instinctually understands, and the survey and polling data reflects. So one type of grievance is an economic grievance, right? People are very upset, they're resentful, they're pissed off because economic situations are not good, because economies are not performing well for everyone, because there's growing problems of unemployment, particularly in Europe, inequality across the West, that kind of thing. If we look at actually, though, the people who are supporting populist parties and the people who express the greatest dissatisfaction with democracy, we tend actually to find that this is not a phenomenon disproportionately of the poor. That is to say, the poor tend not to vote so much for right-wing populist parties. They still actually tend to vote left. In the United States, for instance, they voted for the Democratic Party. In Europe, sometimes they vote for far-left parties, but that's not really the constituency for these kind of populist parties that are questioning a lot of our liberal democratic order. Where you do see actually economic grievances feeding into both populism and democratic dissatisfaction is actually not with people's personal economic circumstances. Those are not actually great predictors of voting, but actually people who come from communities that have somehow or another been disadvantaged over the last generation. So in the United States, for instance, there was a lot of talk about a rural-urban divide, that is to say, rural communities not benefiting as much from globalization and the economic growth that occurred. People who themselves are doing relatively well economically, but come from communities that have been hollowed out by the decline of things like unions, business organizations, and other civil society organizations, a much stronger correlation between how people feel about the economic circumstances of their communities rather than just their own personal economic circumstances. And people from lower educational categories, even if personally their economic situations are not bad, these people also have a disproportionate tendency to express dissatisfaction with the political system in general and vote for populist parties, or in the case of the United States, Donald Trump. So again, it's not so much people's personal economic circumstances that seem to lead to the kinds of problems and resentments we're talking about, so much as a kind of larger sense of where their community has been over the last generation or so. The second type of grievances that people talk a lot about, that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of sessions, are social and cultural grievances. These tend to be better predictors of voting for populist parties in Europe, for Trump in the United States, for expressing dissatisfaction with democracy, than economic grievances are, right? So people who feel like they have been disadvantaged by social and cultural trends over the last years. This means everything from the erosion of traditional norms that began in the 1960s. This means in Europe, growing immigration that has been aggravated or accentuated by perceptions of by the reality, in fact, of large numbers of refugees coming in over the last several years. In the United States, this has obviously also been caused by the growing empowerment of minority groups. All of these things kind of causing a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of disconcerted citizens, and there's a strong correlation between how much people feel like their societies and cultures are changing in ways that they're not comfortable with, and their tendencies to vote, again, either for populist parties or to express dissatisfaction with democracy in general. These are what we call in social science, again, demand-side explanations. That is to say, these are the grievances that have led to the rise of these parties and movements, and to a general dissatisfaction with democracy that presumably is what we're talking about when we talk about the crisis of democracy. But grievances alone, it's really important to note, do not cause things like political crises. They do not force people to vote for populist parties or extremist parties, right? To understand why that happens, you have to understand why democracy in general and the traditional institutions of democracy, including existing political parties, do not respond to those grievances. So grievances are necessary, but they're not sufficient. In order to understand what's going on with democracy, we also have to actually look at how democratic institutions and democratic parties have performed. And the reality is that if we look at that over the last generation or so, that is to say the supply side of the crisis, we can see actually that democracy has performed really poorly. And so we need to think about what that means when we try to address some of these concerns. So what does it mean to say democracy is performing poorly? Well, it means several things. One, it means it's not actually responding to those grievances very well. Two is it's not actually representing the people that it is supposed to be representing. That is to say, there are a lot of people who feel like their grievances, their demands, their problems are not being addressed by mainstream political institutions. And in fact, there is a strong amount of reality to such kinds of complaints and to those kinds of grievances. So if we look, for instance, at what's happened since the financial crisis, there is a general perception among much of the population, again revealed in polling data, that this crisis itself was the result of bad government decisions. This is particularly pronounced in Europe, where things like deregulation, thank you, and the freeing up of, as we saw, somebody mentioned, I think in the previous panel, was stressing the freeing up of financial interests, unregulated banks, all these kinds of things, very much seen as responsible largely for the crisis. And this was seen as decisions that were made correctly by government elites, by parties on both the center left and the center right. General perception of coziness between politicians of the center left and center right, and a lot of the people who benefited from not only deregulation, I don't know why I can't get that word, but globalization some more generally. We also have, of course, a sense that, correctly, that this globalization has had differential impact on different groups in society. Some people have benefited a lot from it, probably a disproportionate number of people in this room, global elites and coastal elites in the United States, but that a lot of other people have not, and that politicians have basically seen them as the kind of, afterthought of what was a generally positive, role for globalization. And this is true not only as far as different educational groups are concerned, but also different geographic regions, not only in the US, but again, you very much see this in Europe, where the benefits of globalization have not been spread evenly within, the boundaries of different countries. Another thing that's important to note that has really been pronounced over the last generation, but has largely gone under the radar, is the changing nature of political elites. If you actually look at the background of those who are leading different political parties, who are represented in parliaments in Europe or Congress in the United States, they have become increasingly highly educated, they are increasingly wealthy, and there are very many fewer people who represent, for instance, true working class communities, the lower educated groups, and this has really created a sense that elites are really out of touch and patronizing. And if you look at the demographic data, it is in fact the case that there has been a shift in who political elites are in the sense of their personal backgrounds, their connections to the communities that they're ostensibly representing. And then, of course, in Europe, you have in particular a sense that national policy is no longer in the hands of democratic politicians. We see this in the United States too, somewhat, in a sense that there are some kind of, global forces out there that are determining what our national governments do and what kind of policies are being made. In Europe, this is even more pronounced because it is in fact true that during the financial crisis in particular, the European Union essentially imposed policies on democratically elected governments. Technocratic governments were essentially imposed on both Greece and Italy. And decisions about economic policy making were taken out of the hands of nationally elected politicians. And so the sense that their own governments were not responding to the needs of their people, that actually was not at all incorrect. Now, whatever you think about the good or bad of those policies, the reality was that they were not, again, they were not seen as being responsive to their own people, and this is really deadly as far as faith in democratic institutions and elites go. I would also stress, again, as far as democracy and democratic institutions are concerned, something that, again, was raised at the last panel, was how actually undemocratic American procedures and institutions are, and this has become aggravated over the last years by things like gerrymandering, voter restriction laws, increasing understanding of how the Electoral College can influence outcomes, and of course the growing impact of money in American politics, all of which have made, in fact, American political life less democratic rather than more, and I think really increased the frustration of a lot of citizens about how responsive their governments really are. So I think that there's a lot going on both on the demand side, that is to say grievances that have been pushing some of these problems, as well as problems within democracies themselves. And I want to end, because I know I only have 2 or 3 minutes, by saying that obviously given the constituency in this room, we've had a lot of complaints about how the right has responded to these grievances and these problems, and I think we all agree on those things, and so they're less important to talk about. But it's also true, in fact, that the center left has fallen down quite a bit. Now, to some degree, we've discussed this. It hasn't been responsive to the needs of many of its constituents. It too wholeheartedly accepted globalization and neoliberalism in the late 20th century. Those things clearly have to change, as do, by the way, responses to some of these social and cultural dislocations. These were mentioned before. It is absolutely imperative that the center-left be able to speak to its constituencies in a social, solidaristic manner. It can't be this identity or that identity, but there has to be something that joins people together. If the left can't come up with an alternative narrative about how all of these different things fit together in one better whole, how its policies are going to help make everyone better, not at the expense of one group or another, then it is always going to lose to that narrative that's coming from the right. And the idea that we are going to avoid this because some progressive coalition is going to miraculously appear because of demographics is incorrect. Not only because there's always going to be a lot of white people out there who vote, but because it's very unclear down the road how different groups will vote. And so if we can't figure out on the center-left a way to bring people together in a way that can speak to them all in a social solidaristic manner, then we are not going to be able to win, and demographics is not going to rescue us. So I'll stop on that cheery note.
So rather than